All right, welcome back. And we're here in the next video in our scoping series. In this one, we're really going to talk about organizing a project. So in our previous videos, we really talked about quickly scoping a project, how to scope it mainly for the purpose of budgets and timelines, for that first conversation with the client to really feel confident, have them feel they know you, and give a quick breakdown of how the project's going to go, get a sense of how the client's working, and maybe even start off on a first phase of research and early preparation. However, scoping a project goes far beyond that, and we have to actually do the scoping work to get a sense of what exactly this project's going to entail, spend some time with the client and figure out the different pieces. So that's data and architecture, front end, back end, user experience, design, all these different pieces that we have to think about when we're making a project, and that in different degrees apply to almost every project that we're going to tackle, especially in web development. So in this section, we're going to talk about this, I think, most important of conversations. I don't think this should be your first conversation. This should be something, especially for a larger project, that you set out with the client carefully. You take half an hour or an hour and go through all their ideas, organize what they want into your own language, and ultimately rephrase it back to them in some kind of written form. This last point is really important. Don't forget to send it back to them in some written form. Different people do this in different ways. I just send an email with some point form. Some people make a really detailed type of PDF proposal. Whatever works for you, whatever feels good. But it's really important to have something written so that you can send it back and say, hey, this is what I understood that you meant. And that what I'm going to build, does this look good to you? And if they agree to it, at least you have something to refer to later if there was some kind of miscommunication. And it's not just in the air where they say, well, I told you this, and you say, well, I heard this, and then you guys have a breakdown of communication. Have some written stuff, have them say, yes, I agree, and then you're off and running. I don't think you always need a formal contract. I very rarely do formal written signed contracts. I think just having some agreement informally and some trust is enough. Okay, so moving on to the first section of scoping, data. Data is at the bedrock of almost every project that you're going to work on. We're going to go over specific examples in the next section applying to our sample clients, but data could mean the raw information that's coming from a warehouse and getting put in the database. Data could mean just the content that someone's putting on their website, but at the core, data is what's going to be displayed ultimately, or what's going to be the heart of the site. And it can range in complexity vastly between projects, just some paragraphs of text all the way to like really complicated tables of data. Some of the really important things to bear in mind when you're scoping with data is that clients will almost always emphasize that the data is better than it actually is. Data almost always needs cleaning unless some technical person has already looked at it, who knows web development or who knows what you're going to do ultimately and has cleaned it. Otherwise, it's almost always going to be a little bit of a problem. For instance, in my mapping stuff, people often say they have all the locations, but they don't actually have latitude and longitude coordinates. They just have the addresses, and that data isn't sufficient for me to put it on a map. It needs more cleaning and more work. Data is almost always undervalued by the client. Often people will just say, oh, just get that data, I saw it's online. And you have to really emphasize to them that this will probably be difficult and will probably be more of a problem. I'd really recommend data being the biggest thing that you look at on your list. Otherwise, it will get you. If you spend a lot of time on design and you haven't worried about the data enough, ultimately you'll have a beautiful empty shell of a website. You need to actually see the data. You can't scope out a project properly unless the client has already sent you some examples of the data and they are accurate representations. So you need to demand that you see that. If you don't, you can't scope the project appropriately. So administration is our next section, and this is kind of an interesting one that applies to almost every project that you're going to work on. So this section might not seem intuitively important at the start, but I think it's really crucial actually in the scoping, and it's something that clients will really appreciate, which is the ongoing longevity of the site in terms of its administration. Who's going to take care of this site once you're done building it? You don't want the client to have to get in touch with you whenever they want to change. They don't want to get in touch with you for that, and you don't want it, because you don't want to have to log into the site on a sporadic basis once every 3 weeks or once every 2 months to make some database update and risk breaking things, forgetting what things are done, and then having to bill for 20 minutes of work. It's just a big nightmare. So you want to take the time to try to create a responsible system for updating the site or updating the project at the very start. In some cases, this might be really simple, and you can use a CMS like WordPress if it's just updating text or images. If it's actually getting into databases and directly updating like complicated stuff, like in some of our examples, you may need to build a custom administrative system, or if your client has somebody who's technically inclined, you might be able to have them just directly access the database and update columns and rows directly. It's really important here to assess the technical ability of your client and their team, so you're building an administrative system that's appropriate for them. And if you can cut out building that system, for instance, by using WordPress or leveraging WordPress, you're probably going to save a lot of work and a lot of budget and a lot of just headache for yourself, because building an admin system is often repetitive and it's not that exciting unless you're really into it, in which case go at it. But I think this is just a valuable thing for working on the longevity of a project and having a sense that this project's going to go on for a couple of years, or at least 2 or 3 years before it might have to be rebuilt or kind of given a once over. And consider your client to be your administrator unless they have other people that are going to run this site. How are they going to update it? How are they going to maintain it without you in the picture continually? All right, our next section is talking about user experience. So this section is a lot easier to talk about. It's less techy, it's less heavy for clients to understand. It's a lot more imaginative and fun. So this should be a section you have a little more fun, a little more back and forth with your client about experience and ideas and imagination. Now, the idea here is you need to come at your site bearing in mind everybody who's going to interact with it as a user. This could be the public, it could be employees, and it could be admins. How are people going to interact with this site? What's it going to look like? What is it supposed to feel like? What's the idea of it? What are they trying to do? What do they want to do? Continually emphasize the importance of simplicity. That never goes wrong with a client. Always try to simplify what they're doing. That doesn't mean just cut everything out, but focus on this idea of simplicity. Continually return to that will serve you well. Make sure you have a sense of their brand identity, what their feel is. Are they a really modern type site, or are they mom and pop? And you don't want to fit it into what you think is ideal. You want to make sure it's fitting the client's idea of who they are and what they want to present. This is a great chance to get the client excited and to get them feeling like their idea is starting to become a reality, and they're starting to work out all the little kinks and get ideas flowing really well. I'd say that this is really the heart of a good conversation with the client. It's not the most important thing that you have to figure out. I think that's data, but it's the best chance to bond with the client in a way and to really get a sense of what they're trying to do in a big picture. So have fun with this one. So a lot of people make this distinction of backend and frontend when they're kind of organizing and architecting a project. I find it to be somewhat useful, although these aren't ever as split up as they really appear to be. For instance, if we're working on a WordPress site, what is the backend? Is the backend the actual guts of the PHP and database of WordPress? Is the admin interface where people log in, does that kind of serve as a backend? Certainly it's one of those, or maybe it's both, or if you built a custom plugin, it's somewhere in between. And the front end is kind of the admin interface, but it's also definitely the public facing part of the site. So there's this overlapping gray area between backend and front end. It's definitely useful for you to break this into essentially the database side of things, the non-visual side of things, and the visual side, so like the front end code and the front end logic. But in general, this could be actually somewhat artificial that you're setting this up. I'd really think of things more as data, admin, and user experience. I find that to be much more useful. Now, that being said, break things up how you want. You should at least have this rough distinction in your head of things that are going to be more on the invisible side and more on the visible side. And that's essentially back end and front end. Finally, we come to the architecture. Now, this is the funnest part. So as a senior developer, this is an absolute blast. This is the part that you really sink your teeth into. As a junior developer, it's very difficult to wrap your head around the whole project at once. You probably don't have the experience of all the potential issues that could come up with certain data types, or how you're going to store data, or what's an API call going to return, or how you're going to save this, and all those complicated things that come in when you really know a project. Now, that being said, you still want to think about architecture. So what you're really doing here is you're putting together the pieces from those previous sections. So you're putting together data, admin, and front end, and thinking about how are they all going to connect in together. Now, this isn't something you have to share directly with the client, but you definitely need to make internal notes on this as you write up your little list to them. When you're writing up your little list, make sure that on the side you're writing to yourself, how is this data going to be stored in the database? How are we going to access it? And what are the different types of access that we need to have? And how are we going to make it appear and load properly on the front end? Now, this is fairly abstract to talk about without a hard project, but that being said, I'm going to go over a few chunks that you can think about when you're trying to architect. Again, simplicity should be absolutely top of mind. You should really try to strive to cut out as many moving pieces as you can and reduce things down to simplicity. But don't worry if you can't do this, because that really is a senior level thing. It's hard as a junior to know what you can cut out and what you can't, and you're going to learn that over time, and that's okay. But strive for simplicity. That's what you really want to do. So you want to think about, how is the back end, whatever it is, going to interact with the front end? How are we going to get the data onto the site? If it's WordPress, you're going to have to think about, do I have any custom data? How is it going to get output on the front end? If it's a totally custom thing, you're going to have to think about, what API am I going to use talking to what type of front end? How are we going to move this data in between? Really important. Second, you want to think about, how are we going to do new versions of this? How are we going to do updates? Is it going to be some kind of GitHub repository that when we push, it automatically updates? Am I going to upload files with FTP to some WordPress site? You really want to try to nail the deployment process, because that's a big part, especially of larger projects, of your work, is updating versions and having staging versions and production versions. That's all part of the architecture thinking that you have to do. You got to choose your technologies. We might have some examples of that in the next section. I don't want to get too deep to make this too web development specific, but you have to choose. Are you more comfortable with PHP? Do you like Node? Do you like Ruby on Rails? Do you like React? Do you like Vue? Are you doing something totally different? You need to make some technological choices that make sense. So you really want to get into the weeds here. You want to get right into the guts of the whole thing, because you need to think about the implications of your early decisions. So if you design the database and the API in some way, how is it going to affect the more complicated things that the client may want later on? Obviously, this is really hard to talk about in the abstract, but just be aware, this is really a time to reflect, sit back and try to hold the whole project in your head and think about how you need to design things so that all the different parts are going to rotate together. You're designing the machine in your head before you actually start making it, so that you don't have to continually remake it. I really recommend going for a walk with this, for making notes, debating with yourself, or talking it out with your team. Through that, you can really get a sense, and you can start to anticipate the potential difficulties, okay? You need to get into the details. And finally, in the end, before you get started, you should actually start creating some documentation. This isn't formal documentation. You just need to write up what you've come to as a conclusion. We're going to use this system. This is what the database tables are going to look like. Here's the endpoints we're going to need to talk to the front end. Here's what the front end views are going to be and the displays. And here's the problems I anticipate running into later on, or things I'm putting aside. Obviously, adapt that to the type of project that you're working on, but creating a rough sense of how you've architected this thing, so that later, once you're deep in it and you forget about a whole section, you come back and you go, awesome, I thought about that, and I made sure to have that in hand when I started developing this. So obviously this is a lot of fairly theoretical work, but I think these are all the really important parts that you need to bear in mind when you're organizing your project. You need to know the data, you need to know the administrator system, you need to know the user experience, and have a sense of how you're going to construct this whole thing before you just jump in and start coding. So with that in mind, let's go to the next video and let's see how to apply this in a few examples, and hopefully get a stronger sense of how to tackle this. See you.